Okay, so whereas the previous lecture focused on issues of identity and difference, thus focusing on the Asian American and US Latino aspect of this course, this lecture will focus on the other part of the course, popular culture. So the three key terms that you need to be picking up from this lecture are referred to related forms of culture: aesthetic culture, mass culture, and grassroots popular culture. Together, these three terms arrange into what I call the vertical hierarchy of culture. So this divide between high aesthetic culture and low popular culture should be familiar to you by the end of reading the introduction to Hop on Pop. As you see throughout the history of popular culture, there has been a heated debate as to its relationship to those forms of what has been referred to as aesthetic culture, high culture, legitimate culture. Those are the cultural forms that are guarded by cultural gatekeepers and institutions. They are manufactured by cultural elites, both the specific cultural forms and texts, but also the very idea of high aesthetic culture. And thirdly, are seen as having cultural value. So, in terms of high aesthetic culture, we'd be thinking of, for example, what gets taught in high school literature classrooms, what gets taught in high school history classrooms. What are those things that we designate as having a lot of value? So high aesthetic culture oftentimes takes on meaning by its oppositional relationship to low popular culture. Before we go to low popular culture, I've kept the terms that get introduced in the Jenkins reading, Hop on Pop. On the one hand, he refers to mid-cult, and on the other hand, the editors refer to middle-brow culture as a sort of in-between space that's not clearly defined between high aesthetic culture and low popular culture. So it's not going to be important to know what exactly fits where, but instead to think about these different designations of value and the way that they relate to hegemonic ideology. So, oftentimes defined in opposition to high aesthetic culture is low popular culture, which we can understand in two ways. Firstly, we can understand popular culture as grassroots cultural production. Grassroots cultural production we can define as those forms of culture that emerge organically from everyday people, oftentimes in everyday spaces with everyday resources. On the other hand, we can understand low popular culture in terms of mass culture. Mass culture, as you saw in the reading, is defined as those forms of culture created by the culture industry for profit. And as you can tell from the Hop on Pop reading, both the term the culture industry and the term mass culture come from the discussions of the Frankfurt School. So as you try to think of examples, I'm pretty sure that it's easier for you to think of examples of mass culture, which says something about our digital media saturated moment, where most of the forms of culture we come into contact with are produced by very few, oftentimes for profit, and oftentimes follow along very predictable forms. So for example, Hollywood blockbusters, television shows, mass media, all of these are different forms of mass culture. So as we think about the relationship between grassroots cultural production and mass culture, we don't want to insist on too severe of a divide, because oftentimes forms of grassroots cultural production pull from mass culture in the same way that mass culture constantly steals from grassroots cultural production. This is another way of thinking about Abel Payan and Mary Romero's argument that popular culture is oftentimes centralized in the dialectical movement of appropriation and resistance. So, as we think about high aesthetic culture and its others, grassroots cultural production and mass culture, we'll be thinking about two ways of understanding popular culture that are introduced in two of the readings for the week. The first is from Wen and Tu's introduction to alien encounters. So on pages 8 through 10, they argue for four key things to focus on when analyzing popular culture: economics, politics, aesthetics, and pleasure. So in thinking about economics, we are thinking about those issues of money and profit. Who's producing it, who's profiting from it, who is paying into it, these issues of money that drive culture forward. Secondly, we're thinking about politics. When we use the term politics, we're referring to those issues of power. And as such, we're thinking about those negotiations of power that take place in popular culture. So for example, is something in support of hegemony? Does it support dominant ideologies? Does it in fact enable people to experience increased agency? Or does it even lead to counter-hegemonic resistance? Thirdly, wanted to say that we should pay attention to aesthetics. So we can understand aesthetics in terms of whether or not something is conventional or unconventional. In what ways does it meet our expectations? Do we come to see something new from it? And fourthly, they tell us to think about pleasure, or the way that they term it, affect. So as we think about these issues of pleasure, we're thinking about the individual experience of a popular culture text. What sorts of feelings and emotions does it get from its consumers? Who are these consumers who are feeling things? And in what way do these feelings of pleasure relate to these other issues of, for example, profit and power? So even though they mention these 4 different categories, as you can tell from the way that they talk about them, they are all interconnected. Our second approach to popular culture comes from the Abel Payan-Romero introduction to Latino popular culture. They tell us to pay attention to 3 key issues: representation, production, and audience. So as you see from the 1 and 2 chart, we have all these different ways of understanding them in relation to each other. But whereas 1 and 2 focus on processes, we can understand Abel Payan and Romero as focusing on specific people and actors in these processes. So first of all, in terms of representation, we'd be thinking about what does a particular popular culture text say? What does it mean? According to what standards or rules or norms? And in what ways does this relate to a whole network of ideologies? In terms of production, we'd be asking questions of who is creating this popular culture text? Who's distributing it? Who profits from it? What are all those different things that happen before this popular culture text meets its audience? And thus, the third key thing to pay attention to is the issue of audience. Who's consuming it? Under what conditions? How is this consumption limited? In what ways is this consumption open? Right? So as we think about representation, production, and audience in relationship to one another, we're thinking about this sort of 3-stage process of how we come to our popular culture texts and forms. On the one hand, how they're made. In the middle, what they say. And at the end, what happens when it reaches its audience. Okay? So please do ask Christina or me if you have any questions. We're here to help, and welcome to the course.